has shocked some of the people who were so with the South Sudanese for so long, is that just because the government comes out of oppression and fights the good fight, that they're necessarily Democrats in their heart. And what's happened in South Sudan is that the government that come to power is, to put it briefly, more a liberation army than a civilian government. It's still very, almost everybody is an ex-general, and it's very much key. The party, by comparison, is weak. They're all ruling by the ruling party. Let me compare it to South Africa. South Africa, the ANC, Mandela's party, was a very strong political force with a military wing. I would say South Sudan is a liberation army with a political wing, and that's a big difference. And what's happened, because of a lot of internal pressures and insecurities, etc., we saw harassing of journalists, we saw the assassination of a prominent journalist, we saw human rights workers being beat up in the streets, we saw people being run out of the country, etc. And then, in dealing with one of the ethnic conflicts in the country, some real human rights violations by the army, etc. And people began to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? These are the people we supported, this is the people we have big aid programs, etc. And that was hard for people who had put their heart and soul into the cause of South Sudan. But just not long ago, 4 very prominent advocates, people closely identified with the South Sudan struggle, wrote a public letter to President Kiir and said, this isn't what we were about. This isn't what we all thought we were buying into. And then members of the Congressional Caucus on Sudan, which has also been traditionally very sympathetic to the South, wrote a similar letter, public letter to President Kiir, saying, this isn't what we thought we were getting. Now, it's not going to be easy in South Sudan. You have a country that's 15% literacy only. I mentioned to some people earlier that about 2/3 of the parliament is illiterate. Most of the army is illiterate. A very thin group of people across the top who have the education skills to run the country. It has virtually no infrastructure. You can fly over the country and see no major roads. But because of the war, agriculture has not been developed or advanced, etc. A lot of potential, but very little development. And a government that is struggling with keeping a lot of disparate ethnic groups and militias together, and it's a very fragile coalition. And an army that's really a coalition of militias together, and somehow create out of this a state, and hopefully a democratic state. So in my view, for South Sudan, it's also important to stop putting so much attention on their problems with the North, to stop helping the rebels in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. They'll survive without that help. Because that is taking all your attention, threatening your oil supply and all the rest. You've got oil, you've got money, you've got to address this internal challenges of creating a state, a viable state, a democratic state, one that will continue to have international support. So these are the real priorities in the future. The North-South issues still exist, and you have to manage them at the border and all those places, but you've got to turn the attention of the leaders of both countries much more to their interim policy. It's hard to do. No country wants to be told from outside, at least of us, that they're not governing very well. But that has to be the focus. And I think Thabo Mbeki, the leader of the African Union negotiating, knows this very well. He's spoken out about it. Others have spoken out about it. And I think this is the task of the next 5 years for my successor and others who work on this. So that's where we're at. I want to mention one other thing. It may come up in the questions. We talked about oil. And the oil sector, because the West dropped out of the oil business in Sudan because of the civil wars, the Chinese, the Indians, and Malaysians came in. China owns about 40% of the oil sector in Sudan. So one of the questions that we had was, can't China come in and solve these problems? They own a big section of the oil. They're arms suppliers to Sudan. why can't we collaborate with China and get China to help solving all these problems? Well, actually, we do. And I have had a counterpart, a Sudan envoy from China. And what we found was this. On the oil, the Chinese were very helpful. They really worked hard to get the two sides to agree. In oil sector for obvious reasons. But when it came to political issues, when it came to war issues, when it came to conflict issues or humanitarian issues, China said, that's not what we're about in Africa. We come to Africa saying, we come without conditions. We're investing, we're building roads, etc. And no strings. We don't tell you how to run your country. We don't tell you about democracy. We don't tell you about human rights. So the cooperation with China only goes so far. Some people thought it was the be-all, end-all of the way to persuade Khartoum or others to do it. It's not that easy, and it's up to mainly the Africans, leading through the African Union, ourselves, the Norwegians and others, and most of all the Africans. Because what we found, is my last point, is in generating international support for this process, that when the Africans are united, we can keep the UN Security Council united. That is, when, like, the African Union last year laid down a very tough roadmap for both sides and said, this is the way you got to go. We're tired of this war. This is what you have to do. And they turned to the Security Council and said, we want an endorsement of everything we've put down here. Well, who on the Security Council tell the Africans they don't know what they're doing about an African problem? So we had a unanimous resolution, even with threat of sanctions, which coming from the Russians and Chinese is extraordinary. But when the African Union is divided, then the Security Council becomes divided. China and Russia on Khartoum side, other people on South Sudan side. So now as we go into this next era, that the African Union stays united on what the priorities are and what has to be done will enable all of us to back that up with the unanimous international community. If we don't keep that, then people who want to cause problems can always play on those differences. Now, I really will start there and turn it over to questions. But thank you all very much.
Talk from here.
Sure. It sounds like you have a loud voice. Yeah.
I have a loud voice. There's been an ongoing conflict in Chad for decades. And to what extent does that spill over into Sudan and vice versa?
Very much so. And it's a good example of how the Sudan situation impacts on surrounding countries. Some of the rebel groups in Darfur are Zagawas, and there are a lot of Zagawas in Chad. And for a while, in the early uprisings in Sudan, the Chadian government was supporting some of the rebels. Sudan responded by, oh, you think we can't play that game? They started supporting rebels in Chad against Déby's government there. So the two were playing against each other. And that led finally to the two saying, okay, we'll stop this. So what you have now is an agreement pretty much between Sudan and Chad that they will stop supporting each other's rebels, and they both jointly patrol that border. Now, it's not perfect, and it varies from time to time, and there's still a lot of Darfurian refugees in Chad, but the Chadian government has backed off open support to the Darfurian rebels because the Sudanese government played hardball. Yes?
I think it's really a follow-up question. I wanted you to characterize the role of the neighbors, in particular Kagame and Rwanda, and then how do you go from the neighbors to a unified African Union? And did you, as a U.S. diplomat, have a role in unifying the African Union?
Well, quickly, yes, we spend a lot of time on it because, as I said, it's very important if the African Union is unified. Now, what's happened is, I told you at the beginning, the regional countries were very much in the lead on the negotiations to end the civil war. But the regional countries are not unified on their attitude toward this situation. The government of Uganda, just to be perfectly honest, would love to overthrow the government in Khartoum, and they make no bones about it. So you can't have a meeting of the regional presidents in which both President Bashir and President Museveni are in the same room. So that takes out of your use a subgroup called IGAD, which was very important in the early negotiations. The Kenyans, who played a big role at the beginning, have been so preoccupied with their own internal crises later, they haven't played much of a role. This made Ethiopia the big player, and particularly under the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, one of the, whatever you think about his anti-democratic practices, really one of the most brilliant people you could ever deal with, who understood the dynamic. And Meles Zenawi had access to both presidents, President of Sudan, President of South Sudan, and a lot of influence. And he became, I think, the most significant regional player in backing up the African Union and in the peace process. And the African Union, Thabo Mbeki running the negotiations, relied heavily on him to have influence. And I spent a lot of time with him as well. Now, what we have done is that when there was a firm proposal on how to move forward, we of course lobbied, it went through what's called the African Union Peace and Security Committee. It's like their UN Security Council. And we lobbied all the members of that group to stick together and back Thabo Mbeki's proposals and the roadmap that the Africans had laid out. Sometimes people wavered, well, you can't force Khartoum to do this, or you can't form South Sudan. But we tried, and didn't always succeed, to work very hard, because we pointed out not only were these good proposals, but if the Africans are divided, you're going to see the UN Security Council divided, and that weakens the African Union.
We hear a lot of things on the news about Al Qaeda and Al Shabaab. What roles are they playing in this conflict between the two countries?
Well, as I mentioned early on after this particular government that's now in place, that came in 1989, they invited in a lot of radicals and extremists for a while, not only Osama bin Laden, but others. And they changed that policy. There was a falling out within the government, and then they began to expel people like Osama bin Laden and others. Nevertheless, it's not entirely clear their relationship with some of the more extreme groups. We have what I would call a low-level intelligence relationship with the government of Sudan. People think it's a big relationship, but it's not. It's low-level. It's low-level because we don't talk to the president, and they don't think we're playing very fair. And they say, if you got over all these problems with us, we could be terribly helpful to you, because we know what's going on in Somalia, we know what's going on there. But for all the political reasons I've mentioned, we don't feel we can or should have a full intelligence relationship with this country. So we don't get much from it. Now, the other area in which Sudan has become very controversial, ironically for an Arab country, one of their big arms suppliers is Iran. And most Arab countries, you know, Iran-Arab rivalries, but for historical reasons, they have become very close to the Iranians. Well, what the Iranians appear to have done is gotten as a quid pro quo, and again, let me use the map here, is to be able to bring in arms, run them up the coast, and get them into Gaza in support of Hamas. And we consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. The government said, gee, there's a lot of smuggling going on in our country. We didn't know anything about it. But that's hard to believe. So that is a source of contention, and frankly, Israel has bombed Sudan 3 times in the last 2 years to try and stop that trafficking. So it's another area in which, but having said all that, they're as wary of extreme groups that might challenge them as you would want any government to be. So while they may be playing a lot of different things, they're keeping a very close eye on extremists in the country. Hey.
Mr. Ambassador, let's say that the fragile peace holds and you get stability in Mali and the other
weak, poor states in sub-Saharan Africa. Where do they go from here? We know the Washington Consensus is dead, but what does a country like South Sudan do? I went through a quick checklist thing in my head listening to you, and I'm thinking, okay, WTO, agriculture, it's really hard. Europe and the United States subsidize farmers. Manufacturing, the domination of China. The successful Asian countries had the benefit of the US market, and that's dominated by China and other countries. And then commodities like oil. Very few weak countries have been able to manage that wealth.
Well, I think the challenges are very great. Now, oil is often a curse. It's the most easily corruptible resource you can have, and many other countries with oil, it leads to, at best, terrible inequalities, and at worst, dysfunctional economies and governments. But for South Sudan, it's the only resource they had. If they didn't have oil, they would be dead broke, because there's nothing else functioning except subsistence agriculture and husbandry. So it gives them at least the resources to invest if they invest them wisely. The head of the AID, Rashad, claims that there's a lot of agricultural potential there, that with the right technology, they could be major producers. Of course, there's no farm to market road, so it's a big long-term thing, but they could make them a major food supplier for the region. And they have a tourism potential. Believe it or not, this big, beautiful wildlife population along the Nile River that if you're an adventurous tourist, you can go there, you can build up. And if they integrate more with the East African Union, I think there's real potential there. Also, their trade with Sudan, if they would regularize the situation, is also valuable. So I don't think they're as hopeless as the case with no resources. The question is, can they manage those resources well? Now, let's be realistic. They'll use a lot of it to pay people off. That's one way you keep people together. But the question is how much they do that and how much they invest. I've been frustrated because I don't think the government pays enough attention to development. But I'm hoping that that's going to shift.
My question comes from a book that I read by